It's going to be a food fight.
Probably.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call today's hearing of the joint hearing, actually, the House Transportation Finance and Transportation Policy Committee to order. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your attendance. We don't have any minutes, Clark. I don't know what to do. For those of you who don't know, Clark Johnson traditionally approves the minutes of our committee, but we have no minutes today. But in spirit, I'm sure you approve anyway. With that, we're going to move right into our agenda. Those of you who have been following this issue a little bit may know that I did a data request. I sent a rather extensive list of requests for data regarding these issues to the Met Council, and they have responded in detail, and I appreciate that. We are not going to be able to cover every detail in today's hearing, of course. It's just too much data, too much information to be able to possibly look at every number today, but we want to get kind of a feel for what you have found and what you are presenting to us as a committee, and I appreciate your being here. And with that, if you're ready, please introduce whoever's going to go first. Introduce yourself for the record, and go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Again, I'm Judd Shetland. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Met Council, and we are happy to be here today. As the Chair mentioned, we did fulfill a data practice request last week. There is a ton of information there, and as the Chair also said, it's going to be difficult to cover all of that. We don't intend to cover all of that today, but I also want to make sure that if any of you see something in that information that you'd like to follow up on, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you at any point. But with me today is our Metro Transit Chief of Police, John Harrington, and he'll introduce himself here in just a second, but just so some of you folks may or may not know that Chief Harrington actually served in the Senate as well, so he's a former member of the legislature as well, and we're very happy to have him with us at Metro Transit. And with that, I'll turn that over to our Chief.
Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Representative Torkelson, members of the committee, thank you very much. My name is John Harrington. I'm the Chief of Police for the Metro Transit Police Department and also the Director of Security there. I've been serving with Metro Transit for now 6 years, started about Labor Day of 2012. And prior to that, I, as noted, had served for 2 years representing the east side of St. Paul, Senate District 67. And before that, I had served for 33 years as a St. Paul police officer. The last 6 of that, I served as their Chief of Police. And with no further ado, let's get started. You get it to move?
1 second.
There we go.
There we go. There we go.
Oh, well, it's right. Let's see if we get this. Yes.
Perfect.
There we go. And
Good thing I was just about to call minute to come.
Oh no! Oh no! Please don't.
Tomorrow's comment.
In 2012, when I was brought on to Met Transit, I was brought on after there had been a audit and a study of the Metro Transit Police Department conducted by the Upper Midwest Community Policing Institute, and the mandate that I came in under was to professionalize the police department, to increase and remediate the staffing model there, and to bring a community policing philosophy to it. As part of that, we rewrote the mission statement for Metro Transit to talk about protecting our community through innovation and problem solving, and we created a vision of a department that would be both reflective of and responsive to the community that we serve. There we go. All right. Metro Transit Police Department is a unique police department. It is a specialty department. So unlike my prior department, St. Paul, where we were bounded by 50 square miles and we had a population that was of certain dimensions, Metro Transit Police Department responds to over 7 counties and over 90 cities, about 907 square miles. We have the second largest jurisdiction of anybody aside from the Minnesota State Patrol, the DNR, and the BCA, which have full statewide authority. We have the second largest jurisdiction. Once I got to transit, we changed the operating philosophy to localize the policing efforts. So whereas we had been one giant department, or one actually fairly small department, but had a giant jurisdiction, we changed it to have an East philosophy and a West philosophy, or East Command and a West Command. Those are currently commanded by captains. Tony Hines commands West, Richard Grates commands East. Everything from the U of M to the Wisconsin border is in East. Everything from the U of M all the way to Plymouth is in West, and everything north and south of that. We have two really, though, primary jurisdictions that we spend most of our time in, which is our Minneapolis and St. Paul. We are dispatched by our own dispatch center, which is the Transit Control Center. So if you are on a train, if you are on a bus and you have a problem and you call 911, they will refer that call to the Transit Control Center. Transit Control Center will then dispatch one of my officers to the call. And that is one of the things that makes transit policing unique. Unlike St. Paul, and I'll just use a quick example, if you got on the train at, say, Union Depot in the morning and you had an unpleasant experience, something happened you didn't like, and you called 911, by the time that the dispatcher has answered your call and gotten that call en route, where are you? You're not still at Union Depot because you're rolling already. And so now you're probably about here at the Capitol in a couple of minutes late. And so now you've gone from east in St. Paul to central in St. Paul. But by the time they actually get the first squad dispatched, you're probably at Snelling and Uni. So you're now in the west area for them. You're still rolling, though, and St. Paul is trying to figure out where do we catch you. And mostly they don't want to catch you. They want you to get off of the train or off of the bus and be stationary, whereas transit police will chase the train down. We will work with transit control to figure out where is that train likely to light next. So we'll just figure, oh, if we start right now, we can get you to Fairview and we can get on the train and find you at Fairview, and we will take the report that way. Quite frankly, it is a jurisdictional interesting mess, because if you start in St. Paul, by the time you get done, maybe you're a U of M employee, you get off at the U of M, you're now in the U of M's jurisdiction, but the crime didn't happen in your U of M jurisdiction, it happened in St. Paul. U of M's not going to take that report. St. Paul's not going to the U of M. The suspect who continued on may get off at, say, Target Field in downtown Minneapolis, and now he's in Minneapolis, you're at the U of M, and the original complaint happened in St. Paul, and we're stuck. Whereas with transit police, we're not stuck. Transit police essentially covers all of those jurisdictions, and so we will find you at the U of M. We will go find the bad guy at the Target Center. We will not be worried about where the original crime took place, as long as it took place within our transit jurisdiction. The transit department has set up foot beats, because we believe, as a community policing department, that foot patrol is one of the best ways of interacting with the community. We have foot patrols in downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul, and also at the Mall of America. But we also have directed patrol teams that are working currently at Brooklyn Center, at Lake Street. We also have them working on the east side at the Sunray Shopping Center. And periodically, depending on what's going on in the cities that we serve, we will have a directed patrol team there. So, for example, if there's a soccer game at the U of M, we're at the U of M. If there's a football game at TCF Stadium, where we've got a 30-person detail at the Viking Stadium. When there's the State Fair, we have 30 people working at the State Fair. So we move with the problem rather than being locked into one jurisdiction. We have patrol squads that work every day. When I started out at Transit, we were averaging about 600 calls per month, so about 7,200 calls per year. This last year, we were at 67,000 calls for service, so about 100% increase in terms of the calls for service. And this year, at the current rate, we'll cross over to probably 72,000 calls for service that transit police respond to. And those calls are everything from homicides to nuisance complaints, and everything in between we now respond to. One of the things that's changed under my watch is that I think the respect and the professionalism of the department has been recognized by my two counterparts, Arredondo and Hod Axtell, and so we now are investigating and completing our mission all the way from the original call for service all the way through charging cases. We have a bike rapid response team. We have a transit crimes unit, which is part of our responsibility as a group that works on homeland security. That includes a set of bomb sniffing dogs that also work with us. We have people that are assigned for human trafficking. We have folks that are assigned to homeland security. And all of those things are part and parcel of what transit police does. You figure it.
Yeah, we're trying.
Okay. All right. Metro Transit Police Department is currently 185 sworn police officers. 115 of those are full-time officers, and we have 60 part-time officers. Transit Police, when it was first started, before it was really a police department, was all part-time officers. That was, in fact, one of the jobs I had. We started out with officers from Minneapolis and St. Paul. They would ride the buses in their jurisdiction, and then when they got to the border of their jurisdiction, they'd get off and catch another bus. That wasn't terribly efficient, and it wasn't very effective because the buses kept rolling, even if we didn't necessarily solve the problem at that point. We still have 60 of those part-time officers assigned, and they now have region-wide jurisdiction. Those officers work on average 1 to 2 shifts a week. So on average, they're about a 0.25 FTE as far as that goes. So we have 115 full-time officers who we can depend on, and then we have the other part-time officers who are largely these days working special events for us. The department has also gotten much more diverse under my watch. When I came to the department, I was the 3rd black officer in the department. We currently have 32 African-American officers, including, I believe, 9 Somali officers that are on the department. The department has gone from 5% diverse, including people of color and women, to being 50% diverse. And we are the most diverse police department in the state of Minnesota. We have continued to grow the department as necessary. We have kept up with the BCA mandates that have come up on changing our reporting system, UCR reporting, post-training. We have a regular police academy to train our officers as to how to be transit police officers, because it really is, in many regards, it's a case of very advanced police work. Whereas as a St. Paul cop, I need to know the city ordinances in St. Paul, the state laws, and my geography for my little beat that I worked in. My transit officers need to know the city ordinances for 90 cities. They need to know the style and the culture of the police departments they're going to interact with for all 90 cities. They need to know how to book people in all 7 counties. They need to know how to write reports in all those counties. They need to be able to go and testify in all of those counties. So it is a much more robust form of policing. Metro Transit's ridership, and I want to highlight this because we're going to show you some stats here in just a second about how much crime and how much disorder there is on transit. But I wanted to put this into a context that transit is, in fact, one of the safest places in the Twin Cities area that you can possibly be at any given time. To give you some context of that, when we look at 5 years, from 2015 to 2018, we look at all of those years, we had 2,500 Part 1 offenses, and I'll explain that a Part 1 is the most serious types of crime that the FBI tends to categorize. We had 21,000 Part 2 offenses, which are more what we call quality of life crimes. But to put that into context, in 1 year, City of Minneapolis had 22,369 Part 1 offenses. We have about 500 a year. On a bad year, we have 500. Minneapolis, on their good years, have about 21,000. Part 2 of crimes, Minneapolis averages between 25,000 and 33,000 Part 2 events that they involve themselves in, and we average about 5,000 a year. So in comparison with our sister cities, with Minneapolis and St. Paul especially, we are hundreds of times safer in terms of the frequency of offenses happening on transit. If you look at this as we do kind of statistically per 100,000 residents, which is how most cities would look at it, you have less than 1 Part 1 offense per 100,000 residents. We look at them as rides rather than residents, but you have less than 1 Part 1 offense in all of transit on any given year, and you have on average about 25 Part 2 offenses per 100,000 rides that would be on transit. 2018, year we're in right now, we've done some, I think, extraordinary policing in addition to our normal policing. We noted some crime increases in 2017, and so we took action in the beginning of this year to try and make sure that we were out ahead of that. In addition, we also have started a homeless action team, which is responding to a change in the way that the homeless have taken up residence. According to the homeless point in time count, which is done by Hennepin County and St. Stephen's, Metro Transit is the 2nd largest homeless shelter facility in the Twin Cities area. On an average night, we have about between 180 to 250 homeless that when you ask them directly, they say transit is where they reside. It is where they go. And we ask them the question, we've asked this question before, we asked them, well, why is that? And they say there are a variety of reasons. One, transit is safe. in comparison with some of the places that the homeless have to live, this is a safe place. It is a dry and a sanitary place. It is a place where they know that if they run into trouble, they know that help is on the way, and that not only is help on the way, but that transit police are proactively working with them to try and make sure that they get into shelter, and that homeless action team that we are just now in the offing of will even expand that service even further. Thus far this year, proactive times on board buses. So many people saw some of the disturbing video about assaults on bus drivers that we've seen. And so we have increased the frequency with which transit officers are riding buses. Up to this point in the year, we had done about 17,000 on boards, which means we got on a bus, we rode with the driver to try and make sure the driver was okay, sort of sending the signal to everybody else that was on the bus that if they're going to cause any drama, that there was a cop in uniform on board. But we also supplement that with plainclothes officers because it's sometimes good to have folks caught a little bit by surprise. At the current rate, we will do 35, almost 36,000 bus on boards this year. Light rail. Seeing additional crimes happen on the light rail system, we took action and we added more officers to do what we call light rail onboards. And thus far this year, we've done about 29,000. We expect we'll do 60,000 light rail onboards. That's not fare checks, which we did. We'll do 2 million plus fare checks this year. We average about 2 million. I think at the current rate, we'll do 2.2, maybe 2.4 million fare checks this year. But we are riding on board the trains to make sure that we can look out for the riders there and to spot trouble, spot people that are in crisis and try and give them the assistance they need. We are also doing special events. If you go to a special event, you go to a Vikings game, you go to a hockey game, you go to the state fair, you will see transit officers helping police that. We do about 195 special events a year. And so if there's a Vikings game, that's 30 extra officers that are pulled out to try and make sure that everybody gets on the train. We check the folks there for their fares and also make sure that those who have overindulged, let's say, on the way back. Perhaps after the last game, overindulgence was the right thing to do. But we make sure that they get home to their destination safely also. And as I said, responses to calls, we'll do 72,000 easily this year while doing all those other things in addition to that. I have created a philosophy, a policing philosophy at Transit that we describe as the 5 E's, and we apply this as we have special events. We apply this to our special details. We are an evidence-based policing department, which means that we count, I call it cops on the dots. I count every incident, every stop, every accident, and then we categorize them so that we have a sense of where crime is about to happen. It's not a guarantee. But you have a pretty good predictive factor that if you know where crime has happened in the past, that you can then look to say, if I put a cop on that same location, would it in fact reduce crime or prevent crime? And so we have an evidence-based policing system. We're doing community engagement. I mentioned that we are a community policing department. And so we have professional partnerships with BOMA and the Buildings Owner Association, but we also have them with Little Earth, ACLU, and a wide variety of social service networks that are also out there working with us. I believe in education. I believe that, in fact, is the most cost-effective form of policing, is to do public education. And so we do crime prevention. So we're putting signs up. One of our great success stories is when we've had a rash of cell phones stolen from people on the trains. If we simply flash the sign up on the platforms and make announcements to please put your phone away, we see phone thefts drop down because people think about the fact that, yes, this phone is always in my hand typically, but if I put it in my pocket, it's a lot harder for anybody to steal. Engineering. We've had great success working with the engineering department and facilities department at Metro Transit doing what we call crime prevention through environmental design. So in downtown St. Paul, where we call the vertical circulator or the central station, once upon a time there was a big glass skyway there. If you looked through the gas skyway, you would see people lingering in that skyway. Some of those people we found out were, in fact, folks selling narcotics. The engineering department frosted the glass. Now, the people up in the skyway can no longer see their customers. They left the skyway. They went downstairs. When they're downstairs, I've got 4 cops that are working downstairs at the vertical circulator, and they didn't stay very long at the vertical circulator, and we've seen crime at the vertical circulator drop by 45% because of a combination of engineering and good enforcement. And then finally, we do involve ourselves in enforcement. Uniform preventative patrol is the hallmark of good police work. when we have officers on trains, we find that less than 1% of the people that are on the trains are violating our fare policy, and we see people get off, quite frankly. You get on in this uniform, people that want to misbehave decide that the next stop was their stop, figuring that, if I do it here, it just means I'm going to get it caught. So we emphasize uniform preventative patrol, but we also, as I mentioned, we have plainclothes details regularly. We have a great investigations department, which has one of the highest clearance rates in the region. We do a 911 rapid response. So we are a holistic and a full-service police department, with the one exception of evidence collection. We depend on our county partners and our city partners if we have major crimes to have the evidence squad or the crime scene, the CSI folks coming in. We're into the statistics now. When we look at, once again, as I want to remind you of the kind of the comparison I made before. In 2015, Metro Transit took reports on 675 Part 1 offenses. Now, a Part 1 offense are, by the FBI's categorization, the 8 most significant or serious crimes that we know of. Homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. Those are the 4 violent crimes that are categorized under Part 1. And then burglary, auto theft, arson, and felony theft are the 4 property crimes that are considered under the Part 1. So all 8 of those categories together, Metro Transit in that year had 675. In 2017, we saw a spike, as I mentioned, which is part of why we increased our directed patrol efforts. And we saw a spike particularly in November of 2017. In that month, we had 105 Part 1 offenses committed. That was really 2 different sprees of crime. One was we had 2 robbery crews who had figured out that the late night entertainment crowd that were waiting for transit were viable victims for robbery. We arrested both of those crews, and the crime, as you can see, went back down to 52 robberies in December. So making those arrests was significant, and then a combination of crime prevention and arrests on the felony thefts. We found a crew that was stealing cell phones and then were pawning them at one local pawn shop. We executed a search warrant at that pawn shop. That took away their source of revenue from the phones, and once again, we saw the numbers plummet at that point. Crime by type. So this gives you a breakdown of the 8 big crimes. Once again, I think that one of the notable pieces here is that if you look at our Part 1 offenses, 65% of all of the Part 1 offenses are in fact property crimes. The most frequent serious crime we deal with is felony theft, which is in fact theft from person. You have the phone in your hand or you have the phone in your lap and you're sitting by the back door of the bus or the train. The suspect sees the phone there, sees that you're not paying attention, you've got Netflix on or whatever. They grab the phone, run out the back door of the bus or the train. That is considered a theft from person and makes it a felony theft. Whereas the reality is, depending on the value of your phone, it may not in fact have been a felony theft in terms of the actual value of the item. But the fact that they took it from you personally makes it one step below robbery in that regards. If we look at, there's a couple of notable pieces. We had 1 homicide in 2017. We in fact made an arrest on that and got that person charged. That was a individual who was selling heroin laced with fentanyl on our platform. An individual died of the heroin overdose. We were able to backtrack the sale to a particular time on the platform. We were able to identify the suspect and get him charged. He ultimately was convicted of third-degree murder based on his that sale. We've seen crime sex conduct is fairly low. We've had a couple of more this year, and those have been, frankly, crime sex conduct committed on homeless women who were passed out or asleep on our train. And once again, it's one of those reasons why we are going to make sure that this homeless action team is doing more of the right thing. The most frequent of that is robberies. I'm explaining that a little bit. Aggravated assaults really is a function of youth gang activity that has crossed both cities, and we are working collaboratively with the gun violence reduction team in Minneapolis, also with the gang unit in St. Paul, to try and make sure that we are out ahead of those and that we can prevent them as much as we can reduce them. Once again, though, the big numbers that should jump out to you here is felony theft with 553 in 2017. It is still the leading Part 1 offense that we deal with. Reported crime by county. This should come as no surprise, given that I said that Minneapolis and St. Paul are too big, probably 95% between the two there, and Hennepin County and Ramsey County are the two big counties in terms of where we see Part 1 offenses. Bloomington and Brooklyn Center also come in for a little bit more of the Part 1 offenses than anybody else, but frankly, the rest of the suburban agencies, their numbers are in the single digits and are pretty negligible typically. If we look at, once again, by city, I think that once again speaks to the issue of Bloomington had 120 as a city total, Brooklyn Center at 94, Apple Valley had 2, Fridley had 4, but Minneapolis had 1,349. So that gives you a pretty clear sense of where we spend most of our time. We're just going to go to 15. I think that was the next one they wanted. No. So we're moving from Part 1, the most serious crimes that we take reports about and try and interdict.
1 second. Mr. Chair, members, we are jumping a few slides here. We presented this to the chairman yesterday, and they asked us to cover. A lot of the information is covered in different ways, so we're just jumping ahead here. I don't want you to think that we're not covering something, but that same information is provided in different ways, similar to how it was presented when we responded to the data request. So pardon us for jumping ahead, but we're doing it at the request of the chairman. So just wanted everybody to know.
So verified.
All right, thank you.
Part 2 offenses are what we refer to generally as quality of life offenses. They are criminal acts that have more, frankly, more impact on people's day-to-day quality of life. I once said when I was the chief in St. Paul that, you have a murder in your neighborhood, you have a murder in the city, nobody moves because they have a murder in their city. But if you have an annoying drug addict who is urinating on your front porch and sleeping outside and breaking into your car every day, that will get on your nerves enough that you'll start thinking about relocating your residence. Part 2 offenses are those annoying quality of life crimes, and they include things like public use of alcohol, narcotics use, threats, disorderly conduct, fighting, urinating in public, indecent exposure, a variety of the lower sex crimes, prostitution. All of those fit into that secondary group of Part 2 offenses. And frankly, whereas our Part 1s are fairly low, our Part 2s are significantly higher, but even if we look at our Part 2s, if we add all of them up for 4 years, would still not equal what Minneapolis or St. Paul has in even a single year in terms of their Part 2s. So if we look at our Part 2s, our worst year is probably 2015. We had 65-35. That year we shifted our focus from strictly being doing a lot of fare checking on the transit lines, especially on the LRT system, and we began to focus more on quality of life crimes on the system. The urinating in public, the drinking in public, the use of marijuana, the smoking in public, the harassment, those kind of items became much more of our focus. And while we still maintained our 2 million fare checks during that period, we shifted our focus away from just looking for the big crime and started looking at more, how could we impact people's day-to-day lives by impacting the little crimes that were in fact what our customers said annoyed them over and over again. The next year we had a pretty significant drop down to 6,100, and then the next year after that we had 5,100. This year we have done saturation details on a number of locations that still seem to be resistant to our tactics, and so this year you're seeing the result of directed patrol by officers, and I think that is why that number is elevated. And we have been doing that right up through the state fair, and we'll continue just a little bit into the fall, and then we're going to have to create a maintenance plan for how do we maintain the successes we've had at the Union Depot and the successes we've had at Target Field. And we recognize that while we're trying to hold that line, we have a big challenge right in front of us because on a daily basis, we monitor anywhere from 10 to 20 different homeless camps that we all know that when the weather turns, we will be the default for many of those folks that are currently camped out in different places around the Twin Cities. And they unfortunately, they bring complaints of a different nature. Simply the fact that they have that much baggage. Simply the fact that if there is not a bathroom immediately adjacent and our trains are not equipped with bathrooms, accidents do happen, but those accidents become a distraction and annoyance for many of our customers when they see it happen in and around them. If we look at the next slide, it kind of breaks down what those quality of life are. This is sort of our top list of quality of life. You'll see that up at the top, all other offenses. Those are crimes prohibited specifically about transit. So those are prohibited acts, interfering with transit, getting in front of the bus, getting in front, working on the tracks, things that wouldn't be prohibited by anybody else, but they're prohibited by us. So you'd see that as in our all other categories. Controlled substances is a regular part of our mix. It is sort of a comedy act that we go through regularly with kids, because we'll get on the train, you can smell the marijuana, they got the little joint in their hand, you go, you can't smoke that here, and they're going, no man, it's legal now. And I'm like, no, it's not legal. This isn't Denver. I hate to tell you that. It's still not Denver. But they'll put it out, and then, but then they'll reach for a cigarette, go, no, you can't smoke that either. They're really confused at that point. We get lots of disturbances, in part because we have lots of folks that have mental health crisis, a lot of folks that are on alcohol or other narcotics. Because of that, we have lots of disturbances, and that's probably one of our most frequent calls of someone yelling, someone screaming, or somebody fighting on the train. We do have fraud. Fraud is the way that the state code categorizes fare evasion. And so you'll note that that is, in fact, once again, one of our most frequent crimes. We do the fare checks, and so nobody else would find this kind of fraud if it wasn't for transit police officers doing the 2 million checks a year. And we find a significant number of people who have not paid the fare. If we're in plain clothes, we find them, and we oftentimes will find out whether they're a repeat offender. If they're a repeat offender, they're tagged or cited. But oftentimes it's not. One of the things that makes this number a little bit more fungible is that the people that oftentimes don't pay their fare have other interesting habits. And those other interesting habits turn out to be things like they have warrants for other crimes. And so now I have a felony warrant because they had a bad dope case, or they had a felony DUI, and now I've got this misdemeanor tag. So the tag drops off, they go to jail for the felony warrant, and the tag drops off, but we still note the tag so that in future, after they've cleared their warrants, if we find them back on the train, we can still cite them for that at that time. You'll note a significant increase in what we call other sex offenses. About 2 years ago, I was at a national conference and was talking to a colleague from New York City. And New York City that year had made 300 arrests for what they call street harassment. Street harassment is men saying less than complimentary things to women in an enclosed environment, and oftentimes that's occasioned with, it's not crim sex conduct groping, but it is still touching women in the transit environment. We came back from that conference and said to our officers, this is something we're going to take seriously, that we're not going to have that happen on transit. So the officers were trained to recognize what it was. They were trained to take reports on it. We've begun to work on crime prevention materials with it, and begun working with the sexual assault advocates to make sure that when we do have this, we do have the right resources in hand at that point. Because let me tell you, while it may not sound like a major deal, I remember having a woman on the train, a Latino woman, who the man had basically boxed her into the seat. He was rubbing on her leg, and then he masturbated while he was sitting next to her. She was in hysterics by the time that the officers got there. We arrested him. But she's still in hysterics by the time we got him in custody, and we're trying to figure out who can we tell her to talk to that can help her get over the trauma of feeling like she was trapped and could not get away from this man. So we take that very, very seriously, and that is part of why you see this number has gone up in the last few years. We are taking it seriously, and we're doing something about it. We're going to skip the next couple of part twos because, once again, as in the previous ones, Hennepin County and Ramsey County are about 95% of our business. Once again, in the other ones we have here, Bloomington, Brooklyn Center, Minneapolis, and St. Paul are, once again, the areas that we see the most activity in. The next 2 pages are simply breakouts of the Minneapolis and St. Paul data. If we can skip over to part 22. Yep. So 22 speaks to the issues of the LRT system in itself. And we have green line, which is primarily the St. Paul line, and we have blue line, which is primarily the Minneapolis line. But what we know is that we have about a half dozen stations that share the 2 lines, and they are different than just blue line or just green line in the way we police them. They're also some of our more frequent problem spots because they're close to major entertainment venues. And so when the zombie pub crawl is happening, we end up with anywhere from 35 to 40,000 fairly intoxicated zombies that want to take the train back to Bloomington where they came from initially. So if we look at that, we see Part 1 and Part 2 crimes occurring at blue and green line stations. Target Field is one of our most frequent, and then U.S. Bank is the second most frequent, or it's actually the most frequent, 607. Some of these have come and gone. For example, Nicollet Mall dropped off when Nicollet Mall was under construction, but it is back again now. Hennepin Avenue picked up most of the slack for that. The Government Plaza, we seem to have more than our share of protests there that seem to expand from the Government Plaza onto the tracks, and then we end up having to make the arrest because they are, in fact, in violation of blocking transit. Let's see. Let's keep going to 24. Okay. Blue line stations. The blue line stations are really different from the green line stations. I remember telling this to my bosses when we were creating the policing model for the two different lines, that the green line stations are almost all really urban. Having worked in St. Paul, it's downtown, it's Frogtown, it's the Midway, even up to Fairview, it's pretty urban, and even the U of M is fairly urban in terms of that. Whereas the blue line, you get downtown, you get Cedar Riverside, and then it gets to be much more like a suburban area as we get past 46. As a consequence, our Part 1 and 2 crimes at blue line stations highlight Cedar Riverside, Franklin, and Lake Street Midtown. Lake Street Midtown and Franklin have very different problems, but they are both highlighted here. The Franklin station we have been monitoring for heroin trafficking, meth trafficking, and it's a primary depot for folks that are using K2. And so we get both the sales, we get the drug rips of people who are trying to sell those things, and then we get the people that are passed out in the stairwell on the platform because they've over-imbibed of those substances, and we end up with crimes committed because they're unconscious and now they're being robbed or they're having their stuff stolen from them while they're unconscious on the platform. And so that's our Franklin stop mostly. Lake Street is more of a high traffic area for the homeless, and we have a lot of alcohol over in use in that area. And once again, we've had great success in both of them. We've worked with Little Earth. We've worked with the Natives Against Heroin to try and reduce the heroin trafficking up on the Franklin platform. We've had some success with that. And then we have a joint partnership with Wellington, Hennepin County, Minneapolis 3rd Precinct, and us working the Lake Street platform, and we've seen a 27% reduction in calls for service down there. Department of Transportation has also been wonderful, since a large chunk of the property that we're actually policing is, in fact, Department of Transportation's property. It's just in the midst of the urban environment, and so we are the ones that end up policing it. We can skip that. Go to 26. Part 1 and Part 2 at the Green Line stations. Here, Rice Street, our stop here, to downtown, and then you get a little blip at Snelling, which is the busiest traffic intersection in the city. All come up for a little bit higher. So Snelling, we've had lots of traffic complaints. It is also a high volume area for us because we have the A line and we have the green line and we have the 21 and the 16. A bunch of our high volume buses are all there. It also has a fairly high profile in terms of probation officers that are looking for some of their individuals in that neighborhood. We're really looking forward to the stadium being built, though. We really think that's going to be a game changer in terms of the environment that we're policing there, and we're already seeing some of that there. Capitol Rice has been a real challenge for the St. Paul Police Department. They call it the North End neighborhood, and it has been an area where there's been a significant number of gunplay and other activities in that area. We police it regularly. We have noted robberies in the vicinity and also a fair amount of overindulgence in alcohol there. Robert Street, we had for a little while there, we seemed to have a string of incidents where people were being solicited for vice or prostitution at the Robert Street platform. We put out plainclothes details there. We worked with the vice unit out of St. Paul and also worked with the human trafficking detail, and that seemed to drop that volume of the solicitation device there pretty significantly. But the two big ones are the Central Station, which we call the Vertical Circulator Building, and the Union Depot. Vertical Circulator Building is a hub. It has got a skyway area, and it was at one point the busiest downtown intersection for St. Paul and us, and they had robbery reports, we had fight reports, we had aggravated assault reports, all there. We have done a joint process with BOMA, with the St. Paul Police Department's downtown beat and our officers working with the Skyway Coalition, and we've seen a 47% reduction in calls for service at the Skyway since we put that into place. So we've seen that drop down. In addition to that, we also engaged a group of what we call youth ambassadors. That's in fact the name of their organization, and we assign them Monday through Friday when the kids get out of school, and they go down there and they also act as intermediaries to try and redirect the youth to the neighborhood house or to good programming or boys and girls clubs, so that rather than hanging out there because there's nothing else for them to do, they can be directed to a better place. And oftentimes just simply that redirection is enough to cause us to not have to interact with them on a criminal justice basis. Union Depot is different. It is the last stop on the Green Line, and Union Depot happens to be the place where if you are homeless, you have to get off the train. So we check the homeless daily because we got complaints about it on a daily basis. We check everybody to make sure that they paid their fare. And what we're probably pleasantly surprised to find that about 85% of the homeless, in fact, have a paid fare of some kind or another. But many of the homeless also, once again, have other issues, whether that is narcotics habits, they have warrants, and so the Union Depot has become a high-volume stop for the police department because as we're checking for their fares and we get their name, we find out that they may have a warrant because they haven't appeared in court or because they have other issues there. So the Union Depot is more of a homeless issue, whereas the VCB is more of a youth crime issue. I would go to 28. We were asked about citations issued, and I'll note that Metro Transit issued 19,167 citations during the period they were asked for, about 4,000 or 5,000 citations a year. But in addition to that, citations only cover things that are gross misdemeanor, misdemeanor, or petty misdemeanors. Those can all be cited. It doesn't include the felony or the warrant arrest that we also make, and that number would make this number significantly higher. So we issued almost 20,000 citations for a variety of crimes. And that kind of comes and goes with the directed patrol. As the directed patrol are identified to take action in a certain area, whether it's about prostitution, where we're issuing citations for loitering. If it's narcotics, you'll see citations there for drug paraphernalia, possession of small amount, possession of drugs. In some other areas, you'll see it for trespass, or you'll see it there because there are assaults or disorderly conduct and youth fights are going on there. So we have a wide variety of different kinds of citations we issue. The top citation issues that we were asked about, the number one, which I should surprise no one, is fare evasion. When we're minding our own business, which is what we do every day, we work on fare evasion on a daily basis, and so we have gone from 2,200 in 2015. Our best year was 2017, where we issued 3,600 tags for fare evasion, and we continue to work that system. Other cases, traffic, we are allowed to do traffic enforcement. You'll see some of that. Disturbance is high. Controlled substance is relatively high. Other sex crimes is, once again, this year has gone up as we've taken more effective action there. Gambling, we still get a few of those. One of the things we're happy about is the weapons complaints we thought were going to be a big problem because we work in neighborhoods where we know Minneapolis and St. Paul have high rates of shots fired, and we have not seen high levels of weapons carrying or weapons usage on and about the transit system. I think we can skip that one. That one. Calls for service, which is page 32. Okay. And I mentioned that we have a significant number of calls for service. On average, we're doing between 60 and 70,000 calls for service with the officers we have. We separate the calls for service into two categories. We separate them into officer-initiated calls for service and then citizen-initiated calls for service. So you're at the Brooklyn Center Transit Station, you see somebody that you think has a weapon. You make a 911 call, we dispatch Metro Transit Police there. That's a citizens or a CAD-driven call for service. We will do an investigation. We will do a follow-up investigation. Flip that script. The officer is standing there, and as he's watching the people come and go, he sees what looks to be a knife in the back pocket of a young person that's getting off the bus. He would go over and interdict the young person and say, can I see your ID? Why do you have a knife? Is that illegal? That's an officer-initiated call for service. He's still going to check out. He's still going to write a report. He's still going to do an investigation. The difference is, did he see it personally, a crime committed in his presence or her presence, or did he get called to it by a citizen? We categorize both because we think that where we're having our most success is where we have the officers that are in direct contact with the community and that they are seeing the incidents and they're taking immediate action rather than waiting for the call to come in. But we'll take them either way. Hotspots, I mentioned that we're an evidence-based policing operation, and so every 2 weeks we sit down as a collective, both divisions or both commands, the investigative division, all sit down together along with our partners. Bus will sit down with us, rail will sit down with us, customer service will sit down with us to try and facilities will sit down with us to try and analyze the crime data we've had for the last 2 weeks to try and figure out where do we need to be for the next 2 weeks. We've had a series of hotspots, and because these hotspots didn't go away under normal circumstances, we asked for additional funding this year to put in overtime details at these hotspots to figure out how could we fill the gap where we found that the crime was going on. Brooklyn Center Transit Station is one of those. This year we've had a 27% reduction in calls for service. What we really did there is we normally had cops there in the early morning, we had cops there late at night, but we didn't have cops there during the afternoon. And so our directed patrol was get there at noon, stay until the evening shift gets there, and now when the kids get off the train or get off the bus, they see a cop standing there, they can make a good decision given enough information. Target Field Station in the Downtown Improvement District in Minneapolis. We've seen a 44% reduction in calls for service to downtown Minneapolis since we put directed patrol. We have dual directed patrols currently. We have 2 that work on Hennepin and 2 that work on Nicollet. And then oftentimes, as not, we'll have a team that's floating throughout downtown because with special events, with a Twins game, with Hamilton, we have all these extra people that are suddenly in downtown, and we need to make sure that we're there and visible so that they feel safe and that those folks that might want to commit crimes feel like they should go someplace else and commit them. The Franklin Avenue Station, I talked about that already. A new innovation has really allowed us to do more work there. We now have a camera system that allows us to look in at the transit station from our squad cars. And so we dial up the signal for the little elevator there, and you see 2 people in there, and they're doing a hand-to-hand, and then the needle comes out, and then we run up and we grab both of them. And so we get both the seller and the buyer, and we can do something about that. And frankly, we would not be as successful if we didn't have the camera system in place at that point. Chicago Lake Transit System Center, we had complaints there of people using marijuana in the bus stop there. Once again, foot patrol detail there. We've seen a 29% reduction there. Mall of America Transit Center, we also have an ongoing partnership with the Mall of America. We have not seen a great deal of crime at the Mall of America, quite frankly.
I moved it.
Yep, and you can move on to the East Command ones.
There you go.
Okay. The East Command is significantly quieter than Minneapolis, and that would make sense if you look at the volume of Part 1 and Part 2s on the 2 cities. Snelling Avenue has been a focus area because we had youth crime there. We had a significant amount of disorder there. It has dropped down to not needing much more than a maintenance presence there. Capitol Rice needs a little bit more of a presence, frankly, and so we've shifted bodies from the Snelling station down to the Capitol Rice station, but most of our efforts in downtown are either at the Union Depot or at the Central Station. We spend every day down there, and in part, partly the city of St. Paul passed an ordinance that required us to have multiple beat officers at the Skyway location, and so our folks are anchored at the Skyway location, but anchored is, or maybe they're tethered. That's maybe a better term of the word. They start at that station. The kids know, and we can really tell. We can watch at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when we're having shift change. You'll start seeing kids sort of gravitate into the station. By 3 o'clock, they're all gone because that's the afternoon shift is on site by 3 o'clock. But they know when we're there and when we're not, and they make good decisions based on that. As I mentioned, Snelling's hot. Right now, vertical circulator has been really dropped down to a good level. And then the homeless action team is doing a lot of the work at the Union Depot. Investigations, I'm very, very proud of. We had a very thin investigative unit when I got there. That unit has beefed up. We have folks that are now trained to do sex crimes investigations. When the story came out about whether or not any departments still had sex crimes sitting around waiting, we had 0. We have a very diligent, Lori Ammon is our sex crimes investigator, and she has gotten some great convictions, and she's taken on some really, really tough cases. Our cases, they have the advantage of oftentimes there is video of some part of the case, but it's still oftentimes, our victims are oftentimes homeless. And so trying to find our victims to come in and testify, to take it, to do the lineup, to do the DNA, to do all the SARS kit stuff becomes much more of a challenge for us than it would be from a residential perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the operator assaults were a major focus. We increased the number of officers riding buses to make sure that the bus drivers felt like they were being listened to and that they were safe. We have an outstanding clearance rate. Every year, felony driver assaults, we've had a 100% clearance rate. There is not a driver assault of a felony kind that that my cops and my investigators have not found the bad guy, arrested the bad guy, and gotten the bad guy charged. That is unheard of in my business to have a 100% clearance rate. But even gross misdemeanor spits, which I once came before you to testify in trying to get the spit law passed, we are 55, 44%, 60%. We have regular clearance rates on that. And we also pay a great deal of attention to crimes committed against passengers. So while the drivers are certainly one of our primary focuses, passenger assaults, we have a 48%. This year, I think we're closer to a 54% rate on passenger assaults. Aggravated assault, felony thefts, we're working on all of those to make sure that they not only get reported, but they get investigated and they get followed up so that the bad guy can, in fact, be held accountable. We can skip over that because that's just that's sort of more pictures of the directed patrol.
Yep.
Let's skip to page 45, which is failure to pay fare. I mentioned several times that we've checked more than 2 million fares. This year, I think we're probably going to be closer to 2.4, 2 million. Just to put this into context, fare checks are for us, it's the traffic stops of Metro Transit. So if you're a regular cop, you make traffic stops as part of your regular day-to-day. I talked to my colleague over at State Patrol. So the troopers do about 400,000 traffic stops on a year. And we're making 5 times as many fare checks as that. And the troopers, if anybody's gotten caught by them, you know they're fairly relentless, and so are we. We are in lots of places. We recognize that when we're on the trains in uniform doing fare checks, we see fare evasion drop down. Sometimes it drops down because we, in fact, catch the guy that has not paid their fare. But you can watch this from one end of the car to the other. You start at one end of the car, and the next train station, 4 people get off. Now, they could have just been getting off because it was their stop. Or they could have been getting off because we were going to get to them and ask for that proof of fare when we got there. We have done more and more work with that, both plainclothes and uniform work. The A line, we have been, which is our first, our BRT line, we have been working diligently to both do more fare checks there. And that's another success story that we've had where we've been able to use CSOs, community service officers, to supplement the police department's sworn staff to be a visible presence on there. The next page is so small a type. If you can read it, you're better than me. It's blue line, fare evasion, citations and warnings, green line, citations, and North Star. North Star has the lowest rate of citations and warnings, which is not unusual for a commuter line. Green line has a much higher level. It is the area that we have probably more fare on boards and we do more fare checks. Blue line is a little of both. The downtown to the Cedar Riverside area, lots of fare checks there. When you get to the suburban lines down to 46, down to the VA, the checking gets thinner because the population down there is really regularly always got their fares. And so at some point you get used to the fact that you get to the VA, all of the folks that are stopped at the VA have got their VA card out. They know we're going to check, and it's like, why am I wasting their time and everybody else's time? We do check down at the Mall of America, though, as a supplement. So we were asked about assisting other agencies, and while I cannot tell you how often we ask for assistance, frankly, we could not do our job if we were not in partnership with the local agencies that we work with. But we can tell you that in 2015, we were called to assist almost 2,300 times. So that Minneapolis, St. Paul, a suburban agency called and said, we need a drive-by, we need a squad to show up and help us, and we did that 2,300 times. In 2016, we did it 3,000 times. Last year, we did it about 2,500 times, and we're on track again this year to do it about 2,500 times at the rate we're going. Maintenance of transit properties, and this is sort of this is a little bit of mine and a lot more of the facilities and the maintenance folks. But we were asked about vandalism, and so vandalism here we're talking about things like we have a guy that we just arrested. We just identified he had done $320,000 in acid etching to our windows and to our property. So he's got a bottle of acid. He goes up, takes it to the glass, and he writes his name. And you can't buff that out. You can't cover it up with paint. You have to completely remove the glass and replace the glass. And so I think the last estimate we had was about $320,000 in damage to glass since we've identified him. Graffiti, on the other hand, is much more somebody with a spray can and a marker doing that. So we've seen hours of that. Biohazard is a more less pleasant subject to mention, but it is in fact something that we've taken very seriously. As I mentioned, we have a certain part of our riders that are over-imbibed or over-served. They make interesting decisions occasionally, and then we have a significant, as I said, 250 homeless that live on the train, and they're making decisions about where they have to express their bodily functions. Because we recognize that lacks any sense of dignity for them, one of the things that the facilities department has done is they've invested in porta potties. And at our high volume traffic transit stop where we have high volumes of homeless, we've in fact put porta potties there. And I'll be perfectly honest, when they first did that, I thought this was the worst idea that I ever heard, because when I talked to my colleagues in New York and Frisco and other places, they said prostitution will happen in there, people will overdose in there, people will be getting high in there, and none of that's happened here. I was, like I said, I was the big naysayer on that. Part of that is we've had a really robust conversation with the people that live, quote unquote, in that area. So our first place we tried this was at Lake Street. There were 2 construction porta potties there while they were working on that, and the homeless asked could they use them. And we had a conversation and said, look, here's the deal. We'll leave them here. First time I find somebody conducting an act of prostitution, the first time I find somebody overdosed in there, it's gone. This is so you and the folks that are down here can have some dignity. It's been there for 2 years. It hasn't been tipped over. It hasn't been vandalized. They, in fact, they're very protective of it because it is something that they recognize as helping them. And so we police it. We police it with them. And that has worked really, really well. And glass, as I've mentioned, has become an increasingly problematic item with folks that are destroying the glass, both breaking it and then acid etching. The fleet also has to be taken out of service. So if we have what we call a biohazard, somebody urinates or defecates on a train, that vehicle, the bus or the train, has to be taken out of service. It has to be taken back to the garage. It has to be sanitized. And so it takes it out of service. It means that everybody that else is on that bus or train has to be inconvenienced. And so it is an area that we definitely take very seriously. And we've seen that number grow from 2015 when they had about 476 incidents. This year, year to date, they've had 1,000. And so we clearly recognize that that is an area that we need to work on. The last item I'll mention is that homeless outreach piece. I'm passionate about the idea that we need to do more about the homeless. It's not just the fact that between 73 and 74% of the homeless recognize transit as being their primary place of shelter. It's not just that I've had 3 women who have been sexually assaulted when they were passed out on transit that were homeless. It is the fact that we have in our community this enormous need for people to have safe, respectful, and dignified housing. And I believe as a community police officer, this is incumbent upon me to help be part of the solution and we're not going to push them away because frankly, pushing them away doesn't really work. You can't just kick them off the train and go, oh, we're done, because what happens is they stay in our shelters, they stay in our bus stops, and then eventually here in Minnesota, it gets just stupidly cold, and I will not have somebody freeze to death while standing outside of a glass enclosure that they could have taken refuge in. Last year during the Super Bowl, when we were all freezing and trying to get through the snow, we wanted to make sure we were doing the right thing. So our officers are all equipped with lists of where the homeless could go. We work regularly with Union Depot, with Union Gospel Mission, Catholic Charities, St. Stephen's to try and make sure that we are on top of that. And we have now enlisted 4 full-time officers who are working midnights to try and help the homeless find their shelter, and we're in the process of getting social workers to try and partner with them so that the woman that we have that regularly sits on the train, she's got mental health crisis, she's got gangrene in one of her legs. We need to get her into hospitalization, and that's not going to happen in a 5-minute conversation about do you have your fare. That's going to take a long, in-depth counseling session, and we have officers that are trained to do some good work, but we're not the right people for that. And so we're moving to make sure the right people are employed and out there and safe by having us as their backup there. That is, I think, the summary of my presentation, and I stand open for questions.
Well, thank you, Chief Harrington. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate your presentation. We appreciate your work for the citizens of Minnesota and the riders of the transit system. We're going to take some time for questions. But first, it's really important, I think, that people feel safe when they utilize these systems. And the biggest complaint I've heard from users of your system is they don't feel safe when riding a train or riding a bus. And I believe people deserve to feel safe. And I appreciate the work you're doing, the progress you're making, but frankly, the numbers, as I look at them, and I haven't had a chance to review them in any detail, Chief, but they look like they're pretty flat, that there's a pretty good-sized problem, and it's not going away. I know you talked about statistically that it's, you have a lot of riders, and a very small number of them experience crime situation, but anytime a crime happens on a transit vehicle, everyone on that vehicle is a victim to a certain degree. With that, we're going to go to questions. Representative Kosnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chief, thanks for your presentation. Can you explain to us, just for a base understanding of what happens when we're talking about fare evasion, what's the process? Are there warnings issued? Are there follow-ups? What happens if they're caught again evading fares and such?
Chief Harrington.
President Constance, Committee. Our process is typically on a train. There'll be 2 officers that will approach the train. They'll go to each end of the car. They will start verbally asking people to show them their fares. When they get to someone who doesn't have their fare, they will stop. They will ask them for their identification, name, date of birth, address. They will then run them through an internal system that we have where we categorize everyone that we've caught for fare evasion. If they have never been caught for fare evasion, they will be escorted off the train at the next stop and asked to pay their fare, and then their name is added to that list of people that have been caught committing fare evasion. If they're caught a second time, they are to be issued a citation without any warnings at that point. And that's typically what happens. So we do have a warning system. It is my belief, and frankly, it is also the city attorney and the judge's belief, that people can be confused about the fare system. That's normally the excuse we get when we get to court is, well, I didn't understand. I thought I'd paid. I thought I tagged. My transfer was expired. And oftentimes it's not. On those cases, the case is dismissed. So what we do on our tags is we not only note where they were and we'll note the time, the date, and the location that we had given them warning before, so that now when the judge decides whether or not they're going to, in fact, enforce the $175 fine, they know that this is not their first time, that, in fact, we have explained it to them once before. We've taken them usually to the TVM so they could buy their fare, and so that excuse becomes very thin in terms of believability.
Just to add to that, because I had a similar question when we were reviewing this. And Mr. Chair, it was I asked the question about what happens when a person has an electronic ticket. And if when the police get on and come from one end to the other end, if they say, well, I paid using my electronic ticket, well, that person may have done that, but the chief informed me that what we're able to tell is when they purchased that ticket. And so our officers will be able to tell that you purchased that ticket only moments before you're being checked for a fare evasion. So since we have onboard fare checking like that, I just had that question, and I thought maybe you'd find that interesting as well, because I certainly did.
We also do respond from the bus drivers when they have someone who has not paid the fare. Bus drivers are fare informers. They tell the people as they're getting on that they have to pay the fare. And if someone doesn't pay the fare, and especially if they've done it more than once, we'll get a call. The beauty of our system is that there's oftentimes a good video picture of the person so we get back to that call. You know, he says, this is the second day in a row this guy's bum rushed behind me without paying the fare. We have a picture of them. We just meet the bus, and when they get on the bus, we say, that's not going to work again today. So that's another way that we take care of it also.
Thank you. Representative Howe.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chief Harrington, thanks for all your work you do. But, you know, I've got the, I guess I got the question when you first came on board, the riders or the officers rode the buses to the line and they got off. But it seemed like we had a lot less citations or crime committed. I'm just wondering, have you looked at when you increased the ridership and put those officers on the conveyances that the crime does go down? And I would think that if that is the statistic, why aren't we doing more and more of that and less of driving the transit police vehicles that I see?
Representative,
Chief Harrington.
we have to do both, and there's, like everybody else that has a budget, I have a budget that is set, and so I'm trying to make the best use of the resource I have. I would absolutely agree with you that when an officer in uniform or a team of officers in uniform are on a bus or on a train, we see calls for service drop down because people can make good decisions. But we do have 36,000 calls for service that are not while people are necessarily on that train. And we're not going to be on every bus. There's hundreds and hundreds of buses and hundreds of train consists that we'd have to be on. And so there is, out of our 115-person staff, which you divide that up by 4 days a week, so that's half of that, so that's 55. You divide that by 3 shifts. Now I'm at maybe 12 or 15 people that are working the day shift in East, the day shift in West. There's no way to be on as many conveyances as we would like. And so the rapid response model allows us to try and do both. It allows us to have people on the buses and on the trains, but also be able to respond to the 911 calls when we're needed on there. So it is a matter of, could we do more if we had more officers on there? We absolutely know that. So, for example, this year we proposed to the general manager a program where we saturated trains from 6 in the morning till 10 in the morning with extra teams of officers. And we saw citations were still fairly robust, but we saw complaints drop down dramatically because now there were 6 officers in uniform at a platform and at a station. The issue is we could not staff that 24/7, 365 days a year. It's simply not within the fiscal constraints of that we're operating from.
Thank you. Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to get back to, I think, what you started out, and that is the perception of safety and the real concerns that I think we're trying to address here. And thank you, Chief Harrington, for your detailed presentation. It gives us a lot of data. My concern goes back to comparison of how we are safer on our transit system than the general population in the community. And how we do that, in my opinion, is determining how often we have the potential of being either a victim or witnessing a crime in our particular area. And I think you used the incident rate of the surrounding communities and so many per 100,000 or whatever that might be. Unfortunately, when we go back then to make the same comparison about incident rate per rides, we aren't talking about only one person being counted for those rides. Right. Oftentimes, a ride is, in my understanding, as a ride is considered every time you cross a threshold of a vehicle. So one particular person, over a course of a year, could have crossed that threshold hundreds of times, in reality, then their exposure rate then becomes 100 times higher than the incident rate that you have. On top of that, as the chair said, those that are involved in that same car or bus or train also become victims because of just their perception of being in an unsafe situation. So how do we actually get the real exposure to being a victim compared to just doing this particular comparison?
Representative, we think we were trying to do that because we, in fact, computed this in comparison with 82 million rides. So we, in fact, did compute our numbers in comparison with the gross number of rides, which, as you describe, are as you come on or alight onto the vehicle. So this is our number in correspondence to the vast number of rides that we have. And so we recognize that, yes, every time you have a victimization, in some cases it's a one-on-one encounter, but in many cases, if someone is acting in a threatening manner, everyone on that bus or everyone on that train is, in fact, had got a chance to see that. Many of them, some have been traumatized, some have not. And so we have to be able to respond to that, try and take that person off. I think our approach to this is to try and be as visible as possible. And given our fiscal and limitations of the staff, then the question is how do we pick our spots? And so that is where this hotspot analysis has become important, because what we've done is we've said not every stop do we have a crime in. So as you looked at the list by suburban area, some of those cities had one crime in a year. So does it make sense to have a team of officers in that one city if there's only one crime per year? On the other hand, at the areas where we see repetitive crime, we have tried to put out teams of officers who they can be both visible, they can be responsive to the complaints there, and also deter people from committing crimes.
Follow-up, Representative Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just ask this follow-up question and then I'll let it go. In regards to, I would certainly like to see how you broke down your ridership into the number of riders in order to get that comparison with incidence rates. But aren't we also looking at the increasing incidence rates in particular areas that are also heavily traveled? And so does that have an impact in how you determine the exposure to possible victims? In other words, when you have people riding in a incident rate where there's very low compared to one that's very high, does that also impact then those that are in the high incident rate getting a higher percentage of exposure to possible victims?
Chief Harrington.
Maybe I wasn't clear there.
I'm not sure that I can answer that question, but happy to meet with you and try and go over how we came up with our ridership numbers and how they compare with our crime numbers. But it's hard for me to, at this point, it would cause me to have to speculate to say what did they see and what wouldn't they see if they are in certain neighborhoods. We function within the context, so if St. Paul has a 10% increase in crime overall, it would be not prudent for me to expect that my crime rate would not be impacted by the overall crime rate in the cities that we function in. But we've heard from both Minneapolis and St. Paul that when we have taken effective action, for example, in both the downtowns, what they have seen is they've seen reductions in victimization and reductions in calls, in large part because we have done some of the right things there. So I think it may go both ways. When we're doing the right thing, we are able to help the cities lower their crime rates. But if the crime rate goes up for reasons that we may or may not have any control over, we're going to have to be able to respond to that also.
Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my office and the committee administrator of the Transportation Policy Committee has been trying to obtain data for months, going back to the beginning of session, to the failing of Met Council being able to give us the data, Minneapolis Police Department, St. Paul Police Department, but we're trying to find out exactly how many people have been injured and killed or have fatalities with collisions with rail and bus. Nobody seems to compile that data. Nobody seems to want to give it to us. We hear frequent news reports of pedestrians getting killed. We had one of our own staffers right out here in the corner got killed a couple years ago. But we consistently hear these reports, but we're not able to quantify the safety of the transportation transit system with regard to extra ridership on the outside of the trains. Where can we get that data? Can you help us?
Well, Mr. Chair and Representative Hertas, I'd be happy to help provide that information. I try very hard to make sure that we do follow up on any requests from the legislature. My apologies to you if you're not getting that information. I can also tell you I don't remember receiving that request, but the fact that you're making that now means I'll be working with you and Mr. Bartel in order to provide that, and I'm happy to do it.
Thank you for that response. We've consistently been referred by one department to the other in a round-robin type of situation, and it would be very useful to find out exactly what type of fatalities and personal injuries are occurring from our transit system. Thank you.
Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I must have gotten the list late. I didn't realize there'd be so many questions. I want to thank Chief Harrington for your work on this. It's really important for us to see the data. And I want to say I'm sure the jurisdictional issues are rather tough for you. And I'm wondering what, I know the cooperation amongst the jurisdictions and all the cities that you represent can be tough to organize. Do you have more of a formal joint powers agreement with most of those cities, or how do you interact with them more formally?
Chief Harrington.
Senator Mr. Committee, we have two different guiding documents that we work under. One is the state statute, which says that we are a secondary department, we're a specialty department, which means that the local department always has the right of first refusal on any case. And so we have a shooting in a city, we contact the local police department to find out, do they want this case or do they want us to take the case? Over the last 5 years, the answer has been more and more frequently, no, go ahead, you take the case, you've got the video, you've got the bodies to be able to do this. And so in that case, we simply operate under sort of a mutual aid agreement between the office, between that department and ours. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, we have expanded on that. In Minneapolis, we have an MOU, memorandum of understanding, with the Minneapolis Police Department, because we found that we had suspects who recognized the limitations of our jurisdiction. They were selling dope in the bus stop, and then when we would show up, they'd run into the alley. Well, we had no jurisdiction in the alley, so they would kind of go, you know, you can't really arrest us because I'm not on your property. So we created this MOU with Minneapolis to say, if it's within the city of Minneapolis and it involves transit property or a transit stop, then we were granted jurisdiction so that we can chase the guy out of the bus stop into the alley and still make the arrest and still have the arrest hold up in court. In St. Paul, they asked for a joint powers agreement that did the same thing. So we have a JPA in St. Paul, we have an MOU in Minneapolis, and then I also have MOUs with the U of M, with the airport, and I think there's one more that I'm drawing a blank on what that is, but so we have a mixture here.
A follow-up, Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope it can go the other way, too, in that maybe you can get some assistance from some of the cities. I know they're stretched thin as well. But I want to thank you, too, for bringing in predictive policing and the hotspot analysis. It sounds like you're working as efficiently as you can. And sometimes what happens is when you do start doing citations and the numbers end up going up. So then it looks like, oh, we have more of a problem, when really you're able to address the problem and eventually that stuff will go down, I'm hoping.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do believe that what you see is when you see a spike is that the problems were there. We did not necessarily have eyes on in a way that would allow us to take legal action to document the problem. But once we're there, now all of a sudden we can see the problem happening, and then that becomes a visible deterrent to those who would want to offend to not do it there again.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you, Chief, for your fine work. And you had mentioned the youth intervention program, and I've heard a little about that. It seems, very innovative. If you could elaborate a little bit more about, who these youth are, what do they do, what are their functions, how has their involvement helped the force overall?
Chief Harrington.
Thank you, President Horsey. There are really three different youth intervention groups, or probably actually more than that, but there are three that we work regularly. We work with Mad Dads out of Minneapolis primarily. We work with the St. Paul ambassadors on the St. Paul side, and then we're also working with GVI, which is North Point in Minneapolis, also on their gun violence reduction program. Mad Dads we have deployed to hotspots, so that is a group of anywhere from 4 to 6 African-American men who work for a nonprofit. When we have a report of youth disorderly youth, fights, narcotics usage, we will ask Mad Dads to go there and essentially act like grown-ups. And that's really what they do. They go in, they have a conversation with the kids, and they give them some good advice to say, this is not the place, this is not the time, let's move this on. And then they also refer them to job, and they refer them to housing and social service programs that are available. The ambassadors do very much the same thing in downtown St. Paul. They working out of Hallie Q. Brown, and they intervene with young people who look like they're about to fight, or they look like they were gambling, or they were acting in a disorderly manner. And then finally, with the city of Minneapolis, we have been working with their gun violence prevention program with Sasha Cotton, as they have helped identify some of the highs and the lows and some of the east and the west groups that are actively involved in some of the gunplay. They have allowed us to participate via the bus officers that are working in those areas. If we know that we're having a large party up on, say, the north side, and we think that that might in fact spill over into gun violence, they'll make sure we know. We've done partnerships with the 4th Precinct. We've done partnerships with the 3rd Precinct. And what our job then is to help identify the youth that they're working with and help get them out of there. So frequently, our job is, okay, we can see the fight's about to start, send the beat cops in, they know a bunch of the kids and say, okay, look, there's a bus coming in 5 minutes, and we're going to be on that bus with you. So you jump on the bus, and we'll get you out of here before anything else silly has to happen, and we're there. So nobody else is going to get on the bus with you either. So, and we see a whole groups of kids that will then simply make that decision to say, I don't want to be here when the shooting starts. I don't want to be here when the fighting starts. This is a out. I can walk away from this with some dignity, but I also know that I don't have to watch my back because the cops are there with me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
A final question from Representative Runbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, looking, Mr. Harrington, at, say, 2017, the Part 1 crimes that were reported, do you have any information on the percentage of those that are end up in convictions? I think there were like 252, or actually 562 Part 1 crimes.
I don't have any specifics because what we get is we get the charge sheet from the county and the city attorney on Part 1s. It wouldn't be tagged, so normally that would be, in fact, a charge sheet. And so, but I'm happy to try and follow that up with both Hennepin County and with the Ramsey County attorneys, which would be the 2 attorney groups that would be prosecuting the majority of these.
I'd appreciate it. Be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being with us this afternoon, Chief Harrington. One of my concerns is it's taken us quite a while to get this data. We don't normally have to go to a data request in order to get it. We know that in other cities, crime data is available virtually on a daily basis. I believe in Washington, D.C., they post crimes and where they're happening every day, so citizens kind of know what's going on in their city. Representative Hertaus, I'm sure you'll get your question answered by Mr. Shetland because he's always very prompt in getting things done. But overall, there seems to have been a bit of an effort not to be as revealing as I think we need to be. I think we all need to be honest with what's going on in our communities. I appreciate your being here today and bringing forth this detailed information. I look forward to working with you and with the Met Council to improve this situation. We don't want it to get worse. We want it to get better, and with your help and your dedication to your work, I'm sure it will. Thank you again for being here today, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
I can simply respond really quickly to that. We are, in fact, trying to, one of our pieces of professionalizing the department has been getting the Facebook page, getting the websites, and getting all those other things that our bigger, older departments have already had. And so we are moving towards that, where we're now posting our manual online, we're posting crime statistics, we're posting more information online every day. part of that is simply a matter of staffing. And so we absolutely agree with you that more transparency and more information, more education allows people to make good decisions. And we join you in your support of the idea of getting more information out to the public so that they can make the best decisions possible.
Thank you. I look forward to my next trip on the Green Line, and I hope I feel very safe.
Let me know. I'll ride with you. So.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chair, next I've got Jim Alexander from the Southwest Project Office. In the request for the agenda today, there was a question to have us come and provide an update related to the Southwest Project's agreement with the Twin City and Western Railroad. And so Mr. Alexander will be able to walk you through that. We'll try to move through it relatively quickly, but then we'll be happy to take any questions you have after that.
Thank you for understanding that we're under a time constraint here. If I would like you to really focus on this agreement with Twin City and Western. I don't think need a lot of other information. So with that in mind, please identify yourself for the record and go ahead.
All right, Mr. Chair, thank you. I'm Jim Alexander. I'm the project director for the Southwest LRT project. I'm an employee with Metro Transit. And so to kind of jump to slide 57, we're going to give you a little background on the Twin City and Western's, the agreement that we have with them that we completed earlier this summer. So the Twin City and Western operates freight service through what's called the Bass Lake Spur and the Kenilworth Corridor. Those are two separate corridors, but essentially as a single rail line going through both of those. And I do have a map in the packet to show that. Council, as part of the project, we're looking to acquire the Bass Lake Spur and the Kenilworth Corridor for construction and operation of the project. And there's some siding track that TCW had interest into. Some of that siding track gets removed as part of the project. Some of it stays, and it's primarily located in St. Louis Park and Hopkins where it gets removed. And TCW would need to vacate that siding track in accordance with our schedule on our construction. So here's a map showing the current condition. There's essentially three colors here. The bluish in the lower left corner is what's called the Glencoe Junction that goes out to points west. That's track that's owned by TCW. And so as we progress into the Twin Cities, the red is the Bass Lake Spur. It's about a 6.8 mile length, and then getting into the Kenilworth Corridor about 2.6 miles. And that ends up linking into what's called the Wayzata subdivision. It's not highlighted here, but it's that line that where the yellow tapers off in the upper right. And so you can see the Southwest LRT project in green there with the circles denoting the station locations. And individual boxes show property ownership of what we're going to talk about today as the Bass Lake Spur, currently owned by Canadian Pacific and really operated by TC&W. Canadian Pacific does not operate in this area anymore. Kenilworth Corridor owned by HICRA, that's the Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority. And the TC&W is the rail operator. You see CP is the rail operator here as well. They still have retained those rights to operate, but as I indicated, they do not operate through there today. And the other piece I'll talk about is this common carrier. HICRA is what's known as the common carrier recognized by the Surface Transportation Board, and Bass Lake Spur is CP. So recent actions over the past several months, back in April, the council filed a petition with the Surface Transportation Board proposing changes of ownership. Anytime a land ownership needs to take place, the STB needs to weigh in on that and approve that. And also if there's any change in common carrier status. Later in April, TC&W did oppose that petition. I'm sure you're all aware of that. They actually filed a lawsuit against the Met Council. And so the STB led a mediation with the council, and TC&W CP was party to that as well during the months of June and July. And the outcome of that is that we did reach agreement with TC&W, and I'll talk about those agreements that we reached agreement on. And later in August, the STB, the Surface Transportation Board, ruled favorably on the agreement. So essentially, they approved the transaction where the CP, Bass Lake Spur, would be transferred to Met Council, shown in this next map here. On this map here, and the Kenilworth Corridor, the ownership would transfer from the Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority, or HICRA, to the Met Council. And that common carrier role is on the Bass Lake Spur would be transferred from CP to HICRA, and HICRA would retain that common carrier role in the Kenworth corridor. And what that common carrier role means is that if there is a shipper or someone who looks to ship commodities on that segment of track, that the common carrier has an obligation to pick up service as long as the reasonable means of doing so. Twin City and Western, as the rail operator, they're still the primary operator through this segment. So essentially, the status quo for rail does not change in terms of the operation. TCW has been operating through here. They'll continue to operate. They'll be the sole operator through these corridors. So in terms of the settlement agreement, there are really three agreements: a settlement agreement, a construction agreement, and a co-location agreement, or more of an operation maintenance agreement. Now, I want to emphasize that there are trackage right agreements that are associated with both of those lines. Those remain in place, so those were not amended or anything like that, so they stay in place. And so the settlement agreement came out to be a total of $18.5 million to TCNW for the removal of the siding track. There's about 16,000 feet of siding track that gets removed. There's 10,000 plus siding track that remains in the western port of that Bass Lake Spur. This will also compensate TCNW to provide technical expertise, activities related to construction. Essentially, we're going to be doing construction with an active railroad. We need the TCNW to be alongside as we do that. So they'll have an individual out on the construction site that will be coordinating with as we look to do the construction. The council has paid thus far $2.5 million to TCNW. And the remaining payments are tied to project milestones. For example, once we give a limited notice to proceed to the civil contract, there would be another payment to TCNW. Total amount of that 18.5 is within our budget, the $2.003 billion project budget. And then also part of the settlement agreement, the TCNW does waive all claims against the council.
And Mr. Chair, I'm going to jump in here real quick just to point out to the committee, since we jumped over the funding sources for the project, you see on slide 41 that's in front of us, we talk about the council has paid $2.5 million so far and that there's an $18.5 million settlement. In 2017, in our budget agreement, we passed legislation that said the state is now not paying for the operations or the capital for the Southwest line. So I just want to make sure that you understand when you see these numbers, the council is the project sponsor, but the funding is not coming from the state. It's coming from our partner at Hennepin County. So I just want to be clear because I know I don't want people to leave here thinking that the Met Council is defying the legislature's instruction to not do that, because we are not. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Judd. So the next agreement, construction agreement, this governs the roles and responsibilities between the parties during construction, and it allows for a construction coordination committee. And we've already started that committee. We've met a couple of times with Mark Wagner and his team, and allows TCNW, as I indicated, to review, get really the coordination of really all things that are involved with freight rail as we look to do construction on that Bass Lake Spur and the Kenworth corridor. And it also defines agreed-to dates when TCNW will temporarily suspend rail operations, and call it an outage, so the contractor could be able to do work. And it allows TCNW that inspection piece where they can look at the work and make sure it does meet their requirements. So the co-location agreement, that'll live on in time, and so this agreement goes into effect when we go into revenue service, currently projected 2023. Defines the roles and responsibilities for ongoing maintenance consistent with the trackage rights agreements. Now, since this involves the trackage right agreement that HICRA is party to, the council is not a party to that. HICRA will be party to this coordination committee. And acting on HICRA's behalf, council will assume maintenance and liability responsibilities as the owner of the corridors. That's both Bass Lake Spur and the Kenworth corridor. And TCNW will continue to pay trackage right fees that are identified in the trackage right agreements, and that'll be used to cover maintenance costs. So a little bit about insurance. There was legislation passed in 2017 that requires the council to provide coverage for claims that are related to LRT up to a maximum of $295 million. Now, this is kind of like a but-for, so if there's a freight rail accident that involves LRT, that insurance would kick in. If there's freight-only accident, the TRAs would govern in their requirements for insurance. So, for example, in the Kenilworth corridor, that TRA, the TCW is required to carry $10 million of liability insurance.
And TRA stands for trackage rate agreement.
Sorry about the acronyms.
Yep.
So we've looked at the cost structure as we progress in time once we're in revenue service, and kind of pointing out what Judd was speaking. We are looking to have those trackage rights fees come in through us, essentially go through the county to the Met Council, and we will use those fees to cover maintenance costs and any repair obligations that we have under our responsibilities. So there won't be any request to draw from state money. We see that the TRA fees will cover our cost exposures for a good surmountable time here. So next steps, we are working with the FTA, that's the Federal Transit Administration, to approve a letter of no prejudice that's related to the civil construction contract. And we are looking to, once we have that done, we will close on the freight rail property. So we haven't taken ownership of the Bass Lake Spur or the Kenilworth corridor yet, but the agreements are in place. And once we have see the construction is going to begin, we'll close on those properties, and then we'll look to award the civil construction contract and begin construction.
Mr. Chair, that is the end of our Southwest TCNW update.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions, one from myself. Were there any as a part of this agreement, were there any changes in the actual layout of the track? I know the siding issue was one that was kind of a sore spot with TCNW. How did that get worked out?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we can go back to this map. So there's about 16,000 feet of about a 3.8-mile segment that you can see toward the eastern part of that red line there. That is the area that gets impacted. There's about 16,000 feet of siding track that gets taken away, and that'll be taken out in phases. And so we've worked that out with TCNW of the timing and the amount of how that's going to be coming out. There's still about 10, 11, I don't remember the exact number, maybe 12,000 feet of siding track that's on the west segment that will remain in place. And so we have that all outlined with TCNW, and there's agreement on all fronts with that.
Representative Lucero has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to the two testifiers, my memory serves when the legislature adjourned last May, the budget at that point for Southwest Light Rail construction was under $2 billion, so somewhere around 1.85 billion, somewhere in that neighborhood. And now I see it exceeds $2 billion. Could you explain to the committee what has transpired since we adjourned to push that cost up?
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members, yes, as we've been refining agreements, you've probably heard about BNSF and just the cost of time. There's a lot of big high dollar amount here, so any escalation, we carry 3% assumption for cost escalation. We had to adjust the budget to the 2.003 back in May, and we worked that with the county, and they did approve that budget being the primary local funder.
Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And next question is, in regards to the FTC, which you referenced here just a few minutes ago, when do you expect, is it FDA? FDA, not FTC. When do you expect an answer from them in terms of potentially awarding federal dollars?
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Chair, committee members, we expect to hear that any time now to get that what's called a letter of no prejudice. That's what we're looking for. And we know that these are occurring. LA Metro, Purple Line, just received an LONP to the amount of a little over $400 million last week. So these are occurring on the federal front. So we just anticipate that's going to happen any time now.
And Mr. Chair and members, along those lines, just to jump in here real quick, we are also expecting to see some federal dollars related to the Orange Line that will hopefully be appropriated here soon as well. So hopefully that'll be good news for folks in the South Metro.
And then, Mr. Chair?
Very quickly, Representative Lucero.
Thank you. One last question for clarification. There was a reference to the dollars that had already been spent and a distinction between state dollars versus Hennepin County taxpayer dollars. So just for point of clarification, if in the case the FDA does not award federal dollars for the construction of Southwest Light Rail, the dollars that have been spent to date on this project by Met Council, have those then exclusively been Hennepin County taxpayer dollars, or has any state dollars at that point, will they have been wasted apparently?
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members. Well, the breakout with that pie chart, there's about a little over 30 million that was attributed to state. That money has pretty much been all spent. There's some CTIP money that has been fairly exhausted. There's still some funds left in that. There's still pockets of money left in the Hennepin County and the HICRA that have been approved. And so I don't know if that's really getting to your question, but we have expended some local funds to date.
Right, and Mr. Chair and Representative Lucero, the $30 million that's been appropriated, the first $5 million was appropriated back in 2009, and the remainder was appropriated in 2013. And so there was some things that occurred in 2015 as well, but those dollars really were appropriated 9 years ago, and then again 5 years ago or so.
Representative Varick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to the construction agreement piece. It says in here that you're allowing TCW to review and comment on submittals, and then they get to inspect. Is there something in place that if they see an issue and bring something up, what will the process be so that it's not just, well, they have an issue, but it gets brushed aside? What will happen if they do notice something or have a concern?
Mr. Alexander.
Sure, Mr. Chair, committee members. Well, the extreme case, if they see something that's unsafe, they have the ability to stop things. So we have that in place. But we have this coordination committee, and we have plans. TCW has already worked out, well, they'll have an individual, one of their consultants will be here full time. And so we've already started communicating and having conversations about the protocols and how the contractor's going to go about their work plans that need to be reviewed. TCW will be part of that. They have comments. We will look to incorporate those. Of course, we have the ultimate say, but we are looking to be them as a partner, and so we'll take their comments in earnest. And I would say that going back, we've been working with TCW since 2013, and so we have really gone over all the specs. And we sat down with them back in, I think, 2015 or 2016, the year escapes me, but we went through in detail the plans and the specs with TCW. It just came to be when things kind of came to a head this summer that the lawsuit happened. We've been doing a lot of coordination with them, so they're well versed with the project, and we have a good plan in place to incorporate them into our process.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've seen these freight rail agreements summarized in these, summary documents that you've prepared in, various forums. But is the entire agreement, the entire document available to the public for inspection?
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Chair, committee members, by all means, yes, it's public information. We'd be happy to share this with the committee or however you'd like to see it.
Mr. Chair, I would definitely like that. I think there's some safety issues that haven't been addressed, and I think I'd like to take a look at the entire document. And secondly, and finally, Mr. Chair, you had mentioned the limitations on liability for an LRT-related incident up to $295, and then in a freight-only incident, $10 million. If there's a scenario, and there are certainly scenarios in which there could be a problem that exceeds those liability limitations, who would be then responsible for paying the remainder?
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Chair, members, I think it depends on what happens. Again, if it's a incident that involves freight that also involves LRT, that 295 policy would, from us, from that council, would be in place. If it's a freight-only incident, then the freight would be responsible for that. Now, the trackage right agreement that they have in place requires that they have a policy of $10 million, and that would be still the freight rail's responsibility if there's any incident, just freight only.
But, thank you, Mr. Chair. If there's a scenario, and, again, in Loch Magantic and some of these other places, you had damages in the billions.
Right.
Who would be responsible, to pay those damages that are in excess of either 295 or 10 million?
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members, I would presume under a case like that, when it's freight only, the TCW, if they were the responsible party, they would be responsible for whatever amount it is. They're required to carry the 10 million. If it involves LRT, then it would be capped at 295, or the Met Council's tort goes into play after that.
Okay, one last attempt here. So if it's, let's say that all the public costs, the community costs are, let's say, $1 billion for one of these incidences, then is the public responsible to carry beyond what the insurance covers, or is it the TCW or some combination of the Met Council and TCW?
Alexander.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I would say that for that LRT included incident, that responsibility would be capped at that 295, so the public wouldn't be responsible for anything above the 295. It probably depends on the case if the freight has more obligations under whatever scenario that might be.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, Representative New.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, going back to slide 59, sort of regarding process and authority. So the council filed the petition with the Surface Transportation Board. TCW opposed that petition. So does the Surface Transportation Board have the authority to force that mediation? What exactly happened there?
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members, what had happened is that STB was interested in trying to get this issue resolved, and so there was a reach out to both parties. Actually, 3 parties. Canadian Pacific was party to that because they're part of this filing, as well as the county and the Met Council. And so they reached out to the parties. They offered to do a kind of a STB-sponsored mediation, and it was agreeable to all parties because we were all in the interest of trying to get this resolved. As I indicated, we've been working with TCW since 2013, so it wasn't like we're just kind of met them yesterday type thing. So it was actually a very good venue for us to get together, understand each other's issues, and resolve those unless we got to the settlement agreement.
Sure. So TCW willingly came to the mediation. That was not forced upon them.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Chair, members, yes, that is correct.
Representative Runbeck. Final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the price tag of $2.003 billion was mentioned, my source tells me that it's now at $2.3 billion. And so I guess then I'm interested in knowing where we are in the bidding. Are bids still underway, or what is the situation there?
Sure. Mr. Chair, committee members, well, I'm not sure about your source there, but I would just say that our budget is $2.03 billion, and it hasn't changed since we got that approved with the county in May of this year. In terms of what's out there and what's left to be done, we know our numbers in terms of bidding and engineering contracts. We know over 80% of it right now, and so we're well far along. We still have a big contract out there that needs to go out procurement. It's called a systems contract. It's essentially the equipment to run the train. But we have contracts for the LRVs, the light rail vehicles. We have bids for the civil contract, which is around $800 million. So that's the big piece within this whole piece. But we also have engineering contracts that we have in hand. We understand that. So I would say we're. There's always risk, as you all seen the history of this project. I've been involved since 2011, but we feel like we have things pretty well in hand, particularly when we have those civil bids in hand.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that we've covered this portion of the transportation presentation. While we're getting the next person up, I want to remind members, if you want to turn in an expense sheet, that you can get those filled out today and turned into the chairs of the respective committees. I believe there's blue sheets floating around for you to fill out. So with that, our final presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members. My name is Brian Lamb. I'm General Manager for Metro Transit, and I'm here today to talk about and brief the committee on the operator hiring challenges currently facing Metro Transit, and more importantly, what we're doing about it. And to start out, I want to, is really to cite the booming economy that we're in. And right now in the metropolitan area, we're blessed by an unemployment rate of about 2.6%. And so as many employers right now, that presents also a challenge, finding qualified individuals who are willing to take this job opportunity that's available. And this is a unique opportunity for us because we've never been in a situation where we've had such a difficult time hiring and ultimately retaining operators in our history, and I've been with the organization off and on for 35 years. So with that in mind, one of the things that we wanted to really focus in on is what are the contributing causes and what can we do about it, and ultimately we have a pretty robust approach. But first I want to talk about the symptoms. The symptoms, our brand promise is built around reliability. If customers cannot count on us being there when we say we're there, we are failing our mission. And we take that very seriously. And although over the course of the last several months, we have ultimately been able to meet about 98%, 99% of the service commitments in terms of the 250,000 pullouts that we've had from January through current time. We have seen an increase in the number of scheduled pullouts that we were not able to meet on a day-to-day basis. And that's despite the fact that we had overtime availability and other kinds of things, but we were just fighting essentially a difficult case where we were operating earlier in the year about 30 operators short of our ideal, and that operation went to well over 90 operators short of where we needed to do to put out the most efficient and reliable service possible. So over the course of the last several months, that's all right. I really wanted to say that we did not sit back. We just did not sit back and kind of lament our current situation. We've really attacked this in several different ways. First of all, while the unemployment rate is, as I said, 2.6 from a region-wide perspective, that doesn't mean that every neighborhood or every part of our region has that same 2.6% unemployment rate. So we put a lot of effort in what we call our outreach. So we went to the community centers, we went to the areas where we know that there are higher unemployment rates, and we really focused in on trying to meet the community where they were and trying to give better information about what the job entails, what qualifications that we're looking for. But then we also realized that over the history, only 10% of the people who apply for Metro Transit operator job actually get that job. And the reason why is manifold. Our testing process really has been one that really not only winnowed out people who didn't have necessarily the requisite technical skills, but maybe not necessarily the requisite customer relation skills as well. And so what we really did was to look back and to say, is there something in this testing process that we can do differently in order to get a more robust population of applicants? And what we've done is we've reached out and started to really say, we'll provide some assistance with you before you take these tests. So you better understand the expectations, and that if you fail the first time, that there's a way that you can come back in, learn from your mistakes, and ultimately apply again. And that's one of the things. And so that operator applicant readiness pilot has really shown some great results in recent weeks. The second, and you may have seen some indication of this just even in this last week in the media, is to understand the first couple of years of an operator's career is the most challenging. you're coming into contact not only with their technical challenges of navigating a 40-foot bus through busy traffic, but also you're dealing with all sorts of different situations out in the street. And so our attrition rate the first couple of years is unacceptably high. So what we have done is we've built in now a mentorship program where some of our more experienced operators, and we have 175 operators with more than 30 years of experience. And think about that for a second. These are people that really know the ropes and successfully manage these operations, you know, in their own way over the course of their career, but to act as mentors for new employees. And really, we think that is going to be a recipe for retention. And then finally, we think that we definitely have not only a good job opportunity, but really a good role in terms of a message to how we can help this community grow and continue to prosper. And so our marketing efforts are really focused on trying to introduce to prospective applicants the good pay, the good benefits associated with this. But we also recognize that it is an increasingly challenging environment. And some of the operator assaults in the last year especially have gained increased visibility, and so they should. It's unacceptable for an operator who is trying to do a public service to be subject to potential violence. And so we've been working with our labor union trying to do both hard fixes, but also, I'll say, skill development fixes as well. So we are in the process right now of piloting various operator shields that will protect the operator in a secure environment behind the wheel so that there is no possible danger for themselves or even for the rest of the customers who may be impacted if an operator loses control of the bus. But secondly, we also recognize in reviewing the situations that operators sometimes don't have the de-escalation skills that are necessary to address situations. They actually help sometimes to actually contribute to an escalation of a situation. And we owe it to those operators to do a better job, to train them along those lines. And so what we have done is we've modeled a program after the same program that in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is not the easiest operating environment, but they've had a very successful what they call red kite program over the last few years that has really helped operators better deal with situations, de-escalate situations, but just as importantly, be able to walk out of work at the end of the day without the stress of the world on their shoulders. And we think that's a really important component to our overall situation with our workforce. So one of the challenges that we continue to have is this right here, which is this two-headed or two-humped camel, if you will, and that represents the amount of service we have on the street every day. And one of the challenges is that this isn't necessarily most conducive to hiring full-time people off the street. And when you're in a disadvantaged situation of trying to recruit employees, being able to say you have to be a part-time operator for a period of time before you're eligible to be a full-time, which fits our business need, has been a challenge. And so what we are trying to do is we know that after 4 to 6 months, part-time operators will have an opportunity, just based on our history, to turn full-time. So what we're trying to do is develop a guaranteed program so that they know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel of full-time employment is really what they're after. So we're, Mr. Chair, members, what we're trying to do is attack this on multiple fronts. We recognize that our brand promise is reliability, and we are really trying to, as I say, attack this in many different ways. So with that, Mr. Chair, I want to just point to this last graph, which is really kind of our recovery goals. Right now, we're sit at 95 operators below where our goal is, and we have 1,500 operators on the property as we sit. We have a very robust, in the recent weeks, we've had 15 to 16 new operators per week going through our first orientation, and we think that's really the kinds of numbers that we'll need to sustain. But our goal is to be able to return back to the level where we can reliably say every day what we're going to put on the street is what you can see in the schedule by January, and then by next May, we'll be back at full force. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative Gunther has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell me exactly when can a driver, at what age can a driver retire?
Mr. Chair, Representative, an operator can actually retire not by age, but by experience and by service levels. And actually, many of our operators actually come to Metro Transit later in their career. So they might actually retire from Metro Transit after 10 years after coming here at the age of 52 or something on that line. But they have prorated benefits associated with their length of service.
Follow-up, Representative Gunther.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a friend of mine that came from my hometown that was a Metro bus driver. He retired at 54, and then he got another job because if he would have kept on driving, he wouldn't get any of his benefits that he would have gotten. But he would have just as soon liked to drive the bus longer, but he would lose his retirement benefits. So he started another job in a totally another field, different field. Became a swine herder, by the way. And it could be that maybe if you could make a prorated deal that they get part of the retirement and also continue as a driver, you could get some more longevity. I look at school teachers today in districts in my area. They are used to having 250 applicants for a 5th grade teacher. They've been waiting for 2.5 years to pick one out. Things are getting critical. There's 7/10 of the number of people required. 7 people are there to take 10 jobs. They're stealing from each other. I think your benefits are such that they want to stay there with you.
Mr. Lamb.
Let's capitalize on them.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think you bring up a great point. And in fact, related to that, one of the things that we are working with our labor union on is bringing back retired drivers. They have not lost their skill sets, and many of them are interested in getting a secondary job and not working 40 hours, but maybe working, as I pointed out earlier, during a morning and an afternoon rush hour. So that is one of the initiatives, but in terms of kind of this, how the situation creates a disincentive to stay along and the longer you're that. I'm not as familiar, but I definitely will follow up with that, sir.
Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Lamb, you'd mentioned the safety of the drivers and maybe to the chief. As a representative from a suburban district, a lot of my constituents that ride the bus or ride the train, they have a choice. They can either ride their own cars or they may like the convenience of riding the express route that's very successful, and they like that. Or on the weekends, if they want to go to a sporting event in the cities, sometimes it's convenient. But I'm concerned about what the crime and that we talked about, and I don't want to belabor that point, but I do want to emphasize that I appreciate the efforts that are being made. But what suggestions do you have for riders that have a choice that are critical to supporting the system, the transportation system? What suggestions do you have to keep them and their families safe that they may actually want to choose to ride the trains or the buses? Because I'm a little concerned to take my own family, to be quite honest.
Mr. Chair, Representative, you put the finger right on it. It's the perception as much as it is the reality. And I think Representative earlier talked about kind of how many people who might witness a situation are also victims, and I recognize that. That is why the highest investment that we've made and the most investment that we've made in the last 5 years in any functional area has been in the enforcement area, so that we can do a better job of being visible, because a police officer is a reassuring sight for most, and we understand that. But the second thing is that we ultimately know that neighbors whether it's as an employee or a neighbor who happens to use transit, are our best selling point. Most people don't make that choice based on advertising. They based on it because people that they know and trust say that it. And we've got a ways to go to restore that trust, both with our own employees, but also with the general public as a whole. But I will ask you, Representative, to do try the transit and give me your honest perception about whether the perception is your reality or not, because the vast majority of our customers, and we survey our customers on a regular basis, say that the transit system that they know is exceedingly safe.
Representative Bernardi, the last question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, is there a link that we can go to copy and paste information about these job opportunities that are available so that we can share it with people who might be looking for a job, or could share it with somebody who needs a job, those sorts of
Mr.
things?
Lamb.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I hope, the one thing that I think we all get frustrated when we go onto the internet, sometimes they're the pop-ups. The first thing you're going to do when you get onto the Metro Transit website is see a pop-up, we need drivers. And so that gives you an automatic link into the information that you need to actually make an application. But our bus sides, our billboards, we are really trying to pull out all stops to break down those barriers in terms of making those possibilities easy to understand and then follow up on to the individual. So my question or my answer, short answer would be if they visit metrotransit.org, that will put them on that path.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Lamb. We appreciate your testimony. I have one final question. I was looking at your graph, and I'm wondering how you got my cat to sit still long enough to do his profile, but...
Was your cat the flat one, or was it?
No, he's got ears. The ears are at about 6 a.m. and 5 p.m., I think, so... I thought it was going to be funnier than it actually was.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll tell my cat he's not that funny. Mr. Shetland, any final remarks? Otherwise, we're out of here.
Mr. Chair, members, thank you very much. I will make sure we get the information that Representative Hertas requested, Representative Hornstein requested. I'm not sure if I missed anything else, but I'll make sure that the rest, and Representative Rumbeck asked, I'll get those to all the committee members as soon as possible.
Thank you. We appreciate your cooperation. Members, this meeting is adjourned.